One of the things about talking about Israel and the way it's different from other places is when you start realizing that is different places in Israel are also radically different, whether it's climate, terrain, culture, activity. Israel is just this crazy hodgepodge of a country. So one of the first things that you realize when you go to Israel is that there really aren't any two parts of the country the same. If terrain-wise, if you think about taking California and shrinking it down to the size of New Jersey, you've got the coastal areas alongside the Mediterranean. You've got the mountain range that kind of cuts up the middle. On the other side of the mountains, particularly in the south, you've got desert. Up in the north, you've got woods and forests and green. There are a couple mountains there that have snow on them much of the year. Yes, Israel actually has a snow ski resort. So depending upon where you are, the climate can be radically different. Jerusalem, for example, is, going to see if I can remember, it's like 2,000 feet above sea level. You've got a pretty good elevation there. But then you also have a couple of the lowest places on Earth in the Galilee and the Dead Sea. So if you go from one to the other, the atmosphere completely changes. You probably heard about Denver, Colorado being mile high and a little bit lightheaded. Well, it's almost the opposite when you're down at the Dead Sea and Kinneret, which is Galilee, especially if you're there in the summer. It's hot. The heat actually just kind of seems to build and just sit there. The air becomes kind of stifling, and even though there's water, it's just when we visited there this last time, the heat was up, and so what we would do is we would go travel in the morning before it got too hot, and then by about noon we're like, okay, we're done, this is enough, and we would go back to where we were staying and just stay inside and enjoy the air conditioning, and then come out again probably around 7-8 in the evening a little bit. But it was just hot and oppressive, and it just drained your energy because the air was so thick sitting there. It's a almost a mile difference. I think it's 3/4 of a mile difference in elevation from Jerusalem down there too. And so you may be acclimatized to one, and then you start dealing with altitude issues when you get to the other. And it goes both ways. So it's just a different thing. And then you get the Mediterranean coast, which is just gorgeous and beautiful, and these gorgeous beaches. Meanwhile, Galilee is more a giant lake. It's similar in size to Lake Tahoe in the United States. So it's called the Sea of Galilee. It's not a sea, it's a lake. You can see from one side to the other. It's not even like this. That's the Mediterranean behind me. And yeah, very different. Waves, things like that out here. Galilee doesn't have that, except in the afternoons. The afternoons, the wind comes up and it gets gusty and blows hard. If you've ever been in the high deserts of California, think that. And it was probably blowing 30 miles an hour consistently. I tried to record a couple videos there outside, and the wind was just too much. I couldn't do it. So if you ever read the story about the disciples and they're afraid for their lives out on the water, well, when that wind's blowing, the water gets stirred up, and white caps, oh yeah, you don't want to be out there during that time of the day. So just very interesting that way. But then the culture also varies. Most people, when they think of Israel, they think of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is probably the most religious city because it is the religious center of 3 major religions. So you've got a very high concentration of religious observant Jews, whether conservative or Orthodox. So there's a lot of those. You find a number of observant Muslims. You will find a small population, but of observant Christians, because it is such a center between the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Dome of the Rock, either one that are up on top of the mountain. The Hurdah Synagogue, which is the large synagogue in the middle of Old City. So it's just got this big religious culture. You get closer to the outskirts of Jerusalem, and not as much, but it still absolutely has a role there. Then you get to, say, Tel Aviv, or Netanya, or Modin, and it's just a completely different culture. there. Not anywhere near as religious. There are some, but it is mostly a secular area where they don't have the same standards. The restaurants are still kosher, but you can find non-kosher restaurants if you know where to look and how to look. So you will find things out in Tel Aviv like cheeseburgers with real cheese that you won't find in Jerusalem because of the religious atmosphere there. It's just a very different type of thing. So a good example in Jerusalem, you will find not a real big nightlife. If it is, it tends to be very conservative, very religious. You get to Modin and Tel Aviv, and there's a huge nightlife scene with nightclubs and bars and dance clubs and all sorts of stuff. It's a completely different atmosphere. And again, different culture. When you are at Jerusalem, you can usually find somebody who speaks English. If you get up into the north part of the country, it's much harder because they don't have the tourists. If you get down to the southern part of the country, you may have a little bit harder. However, if you go to Tel Aviv or Modin, there's a very large population there that speaks English. So you can get by without knowing any Hebrew at all there. In fact, when we went to Modin to visit a friend, we ate at a burger place there, and I'll think of the name here in a minute. But it was actually opened up by Americans. The employees are basically all American, or they're kids of Americans. So we spoke English with the same accent we do in the U.S. And then they're still kosher, but they had vegan cheese and lamb-based bacon to put on their burger. So you could get a bacon cheeseburger with lamb bacon and vegan cheese. It was good. Oh, it was really good. So, those things are there. Things that we are used to in America may or may not be here. There are escape rooms. In fact, many of the escape rooms we've seen advertised have an option for either English or Hebrew. I have not had a chance to do one yet. There's only a couple small amusement parks, and actually I haven't even had a chance to check and see if they're still open. There's a water park down by Galilee that I know of, but there's not any major amusement parks or big theme parks or anything like that. So if you're thinking Six Flags or Silver Dollar City or Disney or Universal, nope, not in Israel. They travel out of the country to go see that. And they do. They travel a lot when they're able to. Shopping is going to depend upon where you are. I mentioned in one video, the bartering and dickering at the market. But if you go to the mall, and they've got a number of malls that look just like something in America, then you don't dicker. The prices are set. Bakeries everywhere, lots of bakeries. That's something you don't see in the States very often anymore. But they're all over in Israel. And all sorts of amazing breads. A huge variety of cheeses. It seems like in America we've got just this handful, cheddar and string cheese, or mozzarella, and a couple other things like that. But in Israel, it's all sorts of them. Olives here in America, you find green or black. In Israel, they'll have a whole spread that's just like 30 different kinds of olives, and it's crazy. And see, I love American black olives, but I have a hard time finding them in Israel because so many of them are garlicked or peppered or things like that. And so let's see, where's my olives? But it's just this huge variety of tastes and colors, lots of nuts. A lot of people don't realize how much produce Israel produces. One of the things I've been doing a lot here, I love fruit, and I have been eating tons of apricots, nectarines, peaches, grapes, lots of plums, lots and lots of fresh fruit that they grow in the country. Bananas all over the place, mangoes, papayas, pomegranates. So if you like fruit, you're going to be in heaven in Israel because there's a lot of it during the fruit season. So just a few of the interesting differences. I'll talk a little bit more about how people talk to each other and some of those coming up here soon. But that's just kind of a conglomeration of how the city is not a homogenous thing by any means. In America, we like to talk about America being a melting pot, where all these cultures come together and then they kind of blend. Israel is more like a mosaic. If you think of all the individual tiles on a mosaic, and they're different colors and different shapes and different pieces, and so you've got all these individual things, but they blend together and create this amazing picture, still retaining their individuality, but also coming together in this great society with all sorts of culture and different things. So, yeah, think of it that way. Israel is a mosaic. Hope you enjoyed this little look at Israel and some of the differences there and some of the cultural stuff, and enjoy that last little look at the Mediterranean. Thank you so incredibly much for watching, for everybody who helped make this possible. Hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you want to know more about, and I'd love to talk to you about it. Thanks so much. God bless.